Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I refer to the Prime Minister, my questions to the Prime Minister, and I refer to his weekend boast that he would wedge Labor in this sitting period. But as any golfer knows, while wedges are handy, drivers are what you need to get going. Given Australia is experiencing the slowest economic growth since the global financial crisis, why is the Prime Minister not concentrating on economic drivers that deliver growth, productivity and higher wages?
The Treasurer will cease interjecting. The Treasurer. The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his question, Mr Speaker, and I can understand why the Leader of the Opposition is so focused on his own woes at the moment, Mr Speaker. But what this side of the House is focused on is growing the Australian economy, and the Australian economy has been growing year in, year out under the policies of this government, which has seen record growth in employment, which has seen, Mr Speaker, our industries go forward with our support, because we support all industries, Mr Speaker, not just some. We've backed in our industries, whether it's been in our overseas markets or here at home. We're investing in skills, we're investing in infrastructure, we're investing in lowering the tax burden. And as we prepared this year's budget, we looked forward and we saw the challenges that the Australian economy would face in an increasingly complex time in the global economy, and we put our plan to the Australian people, and the Australian people chose our government and chose our plan, Mr Speaker, and we are delivering that plan. Yet those opposite thought that the remedy to deal with the complex world that the global economy presents to Australia is to take $387 billion of higher taxes and put that on the economy. Mr Speaker, increasing taxes on Australians is no way to prepare them so they can move through the difficult challenges we face. Now, we understood that. We understood allowing Australians to keep more of their own money was the way to ensure that they could have the resilience to deal with the challenges that are ahead. Now, we know that the UK economy has gone backwards in the last quarter. Yes. We know, and those opposite might say, oh, but what about Brexit? Well, Mr Speaker, in Singapore they're not affected by Brexit, and that went backwards in the last quarter, and in the economic powerhouse of Germany, that went backwards, Mr Speaker, but the Australian economy grew. The Australian economy grew because, as the Reserve Bank Governor himself has said, the fundamentals are strong. The fundamentals are strong, and the fundamentals will remain strong under the competent financial management and economic policies of the Liberal and the National parties. The Labor Party left economic wreckage in their wake when they left the Treasury benches, and for the last 6 years we have been cleaning up their mess, and having cleaned up their fiscal mess, we are now taking Australia forward into the future.
Members on both sides. The member for Isaacs. The member for New England.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please update the House on how the government is supporting those Australians affected by bushfires in northern New South Wales, especially the towns such as Tenterfield and Drake in my electorate of New England, and across Queensland and southern Queensland and central Queensland?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for New England for his question on this very important issue that is affecting so many Australians at this particular time. And I also thank the member for Wright, who I had the opportunity to speak to on the weekend about how the fires are affecting there, particularly around Binnaburra, which has been terribly traumatic for those who have been directly involved. And of course the Minister for Water Resources and other matters, Mr Speaker, and speaking to him and his electorate in southern Queensland. Now, Mr Speaker, I thank them for their interest in this and the work they've been doing with their communities to support them at this very, very difficult time. Mr Speaker, southern Queensland and north-eastern New South Wales have experienced unprecedented fires since Friday. It is only September, and every indication is that a hot, dry summer is ahead. And there are over 100 fires burning across Queensland and New South Wales. However, those fires that were of greatest concern over Friday and Saturday, the fires at Tenterfield in New South Wales and at Stanthorpe, Applethorpe and Sarabah in Queensland, they no longer threaten lives and property. I'm pleased to report the advice I have. However, the forecast of dry and windy conditions until Tuesday means that the fire situation does remain volatile. Fire danger ratings are very high for north-eastern New South Wales and south-east Queensland. Fortunately, no lives were lost, though a New South Wales Rural Fire Service volunteer firefighter was seriously injured and is still in recovery while fighting a fire near Tenterfield. Our thoughts are with him and his family. In terms of property, 5 houses were destroyed, another 5 damaged, and 25 non-residential structures have been destroyed in the New South Wales fires. And I spoke to the Premier earlier today again about the response that is being provided and the cooperation. I've also been in contact with the Queensland Premier's office, who is currently travelling. In Queensland, 52 houses were damaged, including 15 houses that were completely destroyed. Fire has also destroyed the historic Binnaburra Lodge in the Gold Coast hinterland and is part of the Australian World Heritage-listed Eastern Rainforest Reserves. I can report the Australian Defence Force is providing support to firefighters at Kokoda Barracks and Canungra. In New South Wales and Queensland, we're also providing disaster recovery assistance. In New South Wales, the assistance is being provided under the jointly funded Commonwealth State Disaster Recovery Funding arrangements, and it is available for the local government areas of Armidale, Clarence Valley, Glen Innes, Inverell, Tenterfield, Uralla and Walker. Anyone in need of assistance should contact the New South Wales Government Disaster Welfare Assistance line on 1800 018 444. Likewise, in Queensland, DRFA assistance is available in local government areas of Scenic Rim and Southern Downs, and the Queensland Government Community Recovery Hotline is 1800 173 349.
And the Leader of the Opposition on indulgence.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I join with the Prime Minister in expressing concern at what is catastrophic events in Queensland and northern New South Wales. As of 8 a.m. this morning, some 55 fires were still burning in Queensland and 47 across New South Wales. These are the worst fires at this time of the year in some 130 years. Disaster's been declared in Binnaburra, Canungra and Beechmont. More than 3,600 hectares have burned in Saraba, approximately 2,000 of those hectares in Greater Stanthorpe. 17 houses destroyed in Queensland, 24 houses damaged. 85-year-old Binnaburra Lodge has been extensively damaged. Lush tropical rainforest burnt. Conditions, we hope, should ease on Wednesday, but hopefully the worst is behind us, but it certainly is not all over. It is very early in the season, but conditions are dry and there is very little rain forecast over the next 4 months. Queenslanders are bracing for the most catastrophic fire season in recorded history, and I spoke to Premier Palaszczuk on Saturday and certainly offered my support and Labor's support, and I'm sure we are all united in offering support across the parliament to people at this difficult time. In New South Wales, of course, 5 homes have been destroyed. Armidale fire covers more than 55,000 hectares and has a perimeter of some 100 kilometres. Shark Creek fire is running out of control, and the New South Wales Rural Fire Service has given an emergency warning. Volunteer firefighter Neville Smith suffered burns while fighting a fire near Tenterfield in the member for New England's electorate, and it's a reminder of the incredible work that emergency services workers do, but also volunteers at this critical time. He's in a critical but stable condition in Royal Brisbane Hospital, and we send all our best wishes to him and, of course, his family at this difficult time. The opposition stands ready to offer whatever support the government, through the Prime Minister or the Minister responsible, Minister Littleproud, deems worthy. This is a real challenge, and at this time of the year points towards an ominous spring and summer coming up, and we just hope that the worst of predictions do not come true. Thank you.
The member for Rankin.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Can the Treasurer confirm that on his watch, Australia is experiencing the slowest annual economic growth since the global financial crisis?
The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, I can confirm on our watch that the Australian economy continues to grow, Mr Speaker, and we continue to reduce taxes, Mr Speaker, and that employment growth is 2.6%, Mr Speaker. Do you know what it was when we came to government, Mr Speaker? 0.7%, Mr Speaker. Less than a third of what it is today. A record number of Australians are now in work. Workforce participation is at a record high. The gender pay gap has closed, and the budget is coming back to surplus for the first time in more than a decade, Mr Speaker. And when you look at the national accounts, economic growth was 0.5% for the June quarter, Mr Speaker, and 1.9% in terms of year average terms, Mr Speaker. The Australian economy has completed 28 consecutive years of economic growth, and under our watch, more people are employed than ever before.
Members on both sides, members on my left, just before I call the member for Lindsay, members can stop interjecting. I'd like to inform the House we have present on the floor this afternoon His Excellency Mr Milad Rayad, Ambassador of Lebanon. On behalf of the House, extend a very warm welcome to you. The member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how the government is getting on with the job of providing stability and certainty for Australian people during a time of increased global complexity and challenge?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And the member for Lindsay is right. It is a time of increasing complexity, and there are challenging times for Australia. And that's why, Mr Speaker, when we sat down and we prepared this year's budget, we prepared the budget to address these circumstances. Mr Speaker, a budget that came together to do a series of things, but most importantly to provide the certainty and provide the stability in economic leadership that Australians needed. And Australians agreed, Mr Speaker. Australians endorsed that plan, and they endorsed the re-election of the government, and they rejected yet another Labor experiment of tax and spend. Instead, they chose a government that was delivering a budget surplus, a financial management record which will enable this government to pay down debt. $50 billion in net debt paid off over the next 4 years from its height in 1819, Mr Speaker, paying down debt. When we came to government, gross debt was growing at 30% per year under the policies of the Labor Party. We wrangled that in, Mr Speaker, and we are now paying down debt as a government. Lower taxes the Australian people paid for. They voted for keeping more of what they earned, and they backed our plan to do that. And the Labor Party, they wanted to put more taxes on the Australian economy, higher taxes. And Chairman Swanee is telling them to stick to their high-taxing, high-spending approach, Mr Speaker. The only realm of consistency you can find in the Labor Party at the moment is they want to tax a lot and they want to spend a lot, Mr Speaker. They are the policies of the Labor Party. Increasing infrastructure spending by around $25 billion in the last budget, and that includes the funding that we're putting into, Mr Speaker, the growth of Western Sydney infrastructure, in particular the development of the Western Sydney International Nancy Bird Walton Airport, which I know is providing a job boom for Western Sydney, and the member for Lindsay is very aware of that. Investing in skills, expanding our export markets, backing all of our industries, including our resource industries, while the resource industry members of the Labor Party walked away every day from their resource industries in their own seats. Mr Speaker, they voted for sensible emissions reduction policies that can be met by this government and are being met by this government. They voted for the stability of keeping Australians safe and keeping our borders secure, as opposed to the flips and the flops of the chaos and the uncertainty which Labor continues to present to this day. Mr Speaker, as a result of our budget management, bulk billing is now at a record level under this government. Mr Speaker, funding for the PBS, funding for hospitals, funding for schools, all guaranteed by strong economic management and the stability and certainty of my government.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Rankin.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Treasurer. Can the Treasurer confirm that the Australian economy is growing substantially slower than forecast in his budget just 5 months ago?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I can confirm to the House when it comes to nominal GDP, it is growing above the budget forecast, Mr Speaker. Above the budget forecast
The member for Rankin.
at 5.3%, and the budget forecast was 5%, Mr Speaker. Now, the reality is, Mr Speaker, we on this side of the House stand for lower taxes, Mr Speaker, and we have passed through the parliament the most significant tax cuts in more than 2 decades. And you know who opposed those tax cuts? The member for Rankin, Mr Speaker, because he likes to take the tax
Treasurer
off,
will
Mr
resume his
Speaker.
seat. The member for Rankin, I want you to be here for the rest of the answer. Well, do you want to walk? The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Yeah, on direct relevance, well, I appreciate you allow what.
No, members on my right. Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. The question involved no preamble. The question was very specific, and while answers you've said before are entitled to a preamble, this one is so far away from the question that was asked, I'd ask you to direct him back.
The Leader of the House on.
Well, Mr Speaker, the question went to the rate of economic growth, of which there are a wide variety of measures, and several of them are being addressed.
Members on my left. And I'm glad that I don't think any of those interjecting on either side are helping either the Manager of Opposition Business or the Leader of the House. I just say to the Leader of the House that is a reasonable point that he made, except for one thing, and that is the material needs to be related to the question. And at this point, I'm listening closely to the Treasurer. He's moved onto the topic of tax, and as I've said on many occasions, it needs to be related to the question. The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, for the member for Rankin's information, on year average terms, the economy grew at 1.9% for 2018-19. The budget forecast was 2.25%, Mr Speaker. Now, when it comes to nominal GDP, the economy grew by 5.3%, and the budget forecast was 5%.
Is now warned.
And as the member for Rankin should know, as the understudy to the former member for Lilly, Wayne Swan, Mr Speaker, the nominal GDP numbers drive the budget outcomes, Mr Speaker, and we will bring the budget back into surplus for the first time in more than a decade. And you can strengthen the Australian economy by creating more jobs, by seeing the proportion of working-age Australians who are on welfare at its lowest level in 30 years, and by cutting taxes, which we have done against the will of those opposite.
The member for Warringah. Could the member for Warringah just pause? Her microphone's not on, I'm sorry, and if we can just start the clock again.
Thank you,
and
Mr.
I'll call
Speaker.
the member for Warringah. Thank you.
To the Prime Minister, times are serious. Peak medical bodies last week declared a health climate emergency, recognising the severe effect climate change will have on human health, especially children's, who are more vulnerable to heat-related illnesses, respiratory disease and hypoallergenic conditions. Today, emergency services are describing the conditions of the fires in northern New South Wales and Queensland as unprecedented this early in spring. Scientists have been warning about this for years. With the gathering of these very grave concerns, does the Prime Minister agree that Australia needs a real plan to decarbonise every major polluting sector by 2050, and will such a plan be presented to this parliament?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The government agrees you need to take action on climate change, and that's why we are. That's why we are. And that's why we
Member for Shortland.
and will meet the targets that were set.
Prime
well,
Minister,
in fact, it was the
Prime
Labor
Minister,
Party
just pause
who
for a
set the
second. Member for Shortland is warned. Prime Minister has the call.
When they were in government, who set the 2020 targets, and when we came to government, we were going to miss those targets by some 700 million tonnes of abatement. But what is going to happen now? We are going to exceed meeting those targets by 367 million tonnes. There's been over a billion-tonne turnaround, Mr. Speaker, as a result of the policies that this government has put in place over the last 6 years to ensure that we are meeting and we are beating our emissions reductions targets. And we have the plan to meet our 2030 targets, as well as we set out at the last election, responsible targets, which we set out tonne by tonne, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we meet our 2030 commitments, because we take these commitments extremely seriously, and we will ensure that they are met. Now, on top of that, we will have emissions per capita fall by 50% by 2030 under the policies we took to the last election, and emissions per capita is now at the lowest level in 29 years, Mr. Speaker. So we are taking the action that is needed to address climate change. Our renewable investments per capita is currently the highest in the world. The highest in the world, Mr. Speaker. We are in the middle of a renewable energy investment boom. Mr. Speaker, that is the reason why we will be also meeting our renewable energy target, which we committed to meet as a government. So whether it's on emissions reduction, whether it's on renewable energy, Mr. Speaker, our government has a plan, has committed to targets, is implementing our plan and will meet our targets, Mr. Speaker. Our government is taking action on climate change, as we should, and we will continue to take that action in a responsible way where we don't have to sell out the jobs for the future to also ensure that we have the future of a clean and green environment.
The member for Moncrieff.
My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on how the Morrison government's commitment to budget surpluses and paying down debt is providing stability and certainty for all Australians?
The Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Moncrieff for her question and acknowledge her deep background in small business, and with more than 30,000 small businesses in her electorate, more than 3 million through the country, she knows how important small business is to growing jobs and as the backbone of the Australian economy, Mr. Speaker. Now, in last week's national accounts, we saw the Australian economy complete 28 consecutive years of economic growth, a record that is unmatched by any other country. And in the June quarter, the economy grew by 0.5% and on year average terms by 1.9%. This is in the face of significant headwinds, in particular the devastating impacts of flood and drought domestically and the global trade tensions between China and the United States. And so what these numbers showed was the remarkable resilience of the Australian economy, and they were a repudiation of all those who sought to talk down the Australian economy, Mr. Speaker. Now, as other economies have gone backwards, Germany, Sweden, the United Kingdom, Singapore and others, the Australian economy went forwards, Mr. Speaker, growing again, Mr. Speaker. Now, our plan is very clear. A 10-year pipeline of $100 billion on infrastructure spending, a record pipeline, 80,000 new apprenticeships, lowering taxes in the most significant way in more than 2 decades, bringing the budget back into surplus for the first time in more than a decade, and creating more than 1 million new jobs, Mr. Speaker. Now, those opposite have a very different approach, Mr. Speaker, because if you needed any reminder of the Labor Party's tendency to put higher taxes on the Australian people and higher spending, you only need to see who came out of the shadows, Mr. Speaker. Who came out of the shadows to have a comment last week, Mr. Speaker? None other than Wayne Swan, Mr. Speaker. None other than Wayne Swan, to remind the Labor Party that not only should they keep their higher taxes, Mr. Speaker, but they should be proud of their higher taxes.
Treasurer resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Relevance.
It's fine. Leader of the Opposition can resume his seat. The Treasurer can continue.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, they don't like what they heard from Chairman Swanee, Mr Speaker, because the Labor Party are addicted to higher spending, addicted to higher taxes, and could you imagine if they put $387 billion on the Australian economy at a time it was weathering these challenges, both domestic and internationally, Mr Speaker? Only the coalition could be trusted to reduce people's taxes and to put more money in their pockets.
The member for Ballarat.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why has the Prime Minister ignored 7 calls from the Reserve Bank Governor since the election to increase infrastructure spending?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Let me quote from the Reserve Bank Governor, August 9th, House Economics Committee. If the economy is not doing well and the global economy is not doing well, we all need arms of public policy to support the Australian economy. But that's not a call for the government to do more now. That's what he said. I just want to be clear about that. I am quoting the Governor of the Reserve Bank. He also said, can I just clarify something? I have not called on the government to do fiscal expansion. Quoting the Governor of the Reserve Bank giving evidence,
members on my left,
not some chat to a journalist, but evidence to the House of Economics Committee. He said, I have not called on the government to do fiscal expansion. In fact, on the 11th of July, he said, I agree 100% with you that the Australian economy is growing and the fundamentals are strong. That's what he said. But I don't think we should forget that more Australians have jobs today than ever before.
The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, on relevance, perhaps the Prime Minister missed the weekend's publications.
The
where the
Leader
Reserve
of the
Bank
House
Governor
will
called
resume
upon
his
you
seat. The Leader of the House will resume his seat. That point of order raised matters not raised in the question. So if the Leader of the Opposition shouldn't raise those points of order, the Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So I think the Reserve Bank, on the evidence before the parliamentary committee, has been very clear. And, Mr Speaker, others might want to verbal what it all means, Mr Speaker, but what I know is I've been working with the Reserve Bank Governor as both a Treasurer and a Prime Minister for 4 years, and it's as a result of the Reserve Bank Government many years ago, its suggestions to us about the need to move on infrastructure, that we have the $100 billion infrastructure pipeline that has been in the budget since April of this year and has featured in previous budgets. Mr Speaker, I know those opposite, if they had the opportunity, would be spending if they had won the election, and that's only because they would have been taxing, Mr Speaker. The first whiff of a surplus, and the Labor Party would blow it all in a heartbeat, Mr Speaker. By contrast, what my government is doing is showing sober, cautious, disciplined financial management, Mr Speaker, to ensure we both achieved the first surplus in 12 years, and we deliver on the $100 billion infrastructure program. We deliver on the tax cuts that we promised to Australians and that we've achieved in this parliament, which those opposite fought tooth and nail to try and stop, Mr Speaker. Now, those opposite, we heard a little earlier today that apparently we're not going to find out what their policies are until 2022, Mr Speaker. You'll need a time machine to find out their policies, Mr Speaker, but whether you go backwards or forwards, they'll all equate to economic irresponsibility.
Members on both sides, the member for Ballarat seeking to table a document. The member for Ballarat.
I am, Mr Speaker. I seek leave to table a document that shows that the Reserve Bank Governor has called 7 times since the election, in fact 17 times since he became Governor, for increased infrastructure spending from the government.
Leave is not granted. And I call the member for Groom.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is delivering stability and certainty by investing in $100 billion worth of infrastructure across the country, including in my seat of Groom.
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, the member for Groom is excited, and he should be. I know the member for Wright is really excited, and he should be, and so am I, Mr Speaker, because yesterday we opened, wait for it, Mr Speaker, we opened the 8th wonder of the modern world. We did, the Toowoomba bypass. How exciting is that? And if you haven't seen it, go on to the internet and have a look at it. It is an ingenuity of masterpiece architectural. Unbelievable. Mr Speaker, his electorate is benefiting, as are all 151 electorates, Mr Speaker, from our $100 billion pipeline of infrastructure projects. And just yesterday, the $1.6 billion, that's a big amount, was opened, the Toowoomba bypass. That's how much it cost. It started under our government, it finished under our government. It's delivery. It's delivery. There's many more. There's many more, member for Ballarat. And just a few statistics on this. 41 kilometres of new road, 24 bridges, almost 60,000 cubic metres of concrete, more than 10,000 tonnes of steel, 4.5 million work hours. That's jobs, Australian jobs. It'll cut travel time by up to 40 minutes, and that's improving productivity, improving efficiencies, eliminating 18 sets of traffic lights and removing thousands of trucks from the Toowoomba CBD each and every day. It truly is, as I said at the start, an engineering masterpiece. It's a masterpiece in design, a masterpiece in architecture, and it's been created through Australian hard work, Australian sweat, by Australian ingenuity. Mr Speaker, I was so proud to be there yesterday. As the member for Groom said, Toowoomba locals can now take back James Street. James Street will return to being a magnificent thoroughfare through this beautiful regional city. Now, local roads will be less noisy, less congested and, most importantly, safer for both motorists and pedestrians. The Toowoomba bypass is just one example of a major nation-building piece of infrastructure that this government has started and now finished, providing ongoing certainty and stability for the Australian people. On Saturday, I was at the Queensland Trucking Association Awards night, and Gary Mann, the CEO of that organisation, said this project, listen to this, it's really important, will enable heavy vehicles to travel west of Toowoomba to the Port of Brisbane without having to encounter a single set of traffic lights. So you can imagine if you're a truckie, you're trying to get from A to B, you've got about 130 or so kilometres from the west of Toowoomba to the Port of Brisbane, and you don't have to encounter a set of traffic lights. How good is that? How good is that? Can you imagine the freight efficiencies that that's going to provide, the safety aspects, the productivity boost that this is going to enhance? Now, I'm proud to announce more than 98% of business generated by the Toowoomba bypass construction between 2016 and 2018 was secured by Australian companies. That's certainty, that's delivery, that's the Liberal Nationals.
Time has concluded. Member for Moreton is warned. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. After more than 6 years of this government, when growth is the slowest it has been in a decade, wages are stagnant, consumption is weak, household debt is at record highs and productivity has actually gone backwards over the last year, why does the Prime Minister spend all of his time talking about Labor and none of his time coming up with a plan to turn the economy around?
Yeah. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. 1.4 million jobs created under the economic policies of this government, Mr President. 75% of those full-time jobs, Mr Speaker. A budget that is coming back into surplus this year, Mr Speaker, real wage growth occurring under this government, Mr Speaker, real wage growth occurring under this government. That's what's happening now, Mr Speaker. People are not only earning more, they're getting to keep more of what they earn, and we want them to earn more in the future. But you won't get higher wages with higher taxes. That's what the Labor Party never understands. They never understand that if they want to tax people more, then they will slow the economy, which will thieve them, Mr Speaker, of their economic opportunities.
Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business.
He couldn't even get to 45 seconds before he started talking about Labor. The question's asking him what's his plan. He's meant to be running an economy.
I'm not quite sure what the point of order is. He didn't state one, but I'll just say of the 7 or 8 topics in the question, one of them was Labor, so he didn't put it there. The Prime Minister's got the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. So our plan, which is to bring the budget back into surplus this year, our plan, which is to deliver tax relief to Australians, our plan, which is to invest $100 billion in infrastructure, which includes just under $10 billion just this year, which is almost 30% higher, Mr Speaker, almost 50% higher than the annual spend on infrastructure that occurred under the Labor Party. So more investment in infrastructure, more investment in skills, more investment in expanding our markets, Mr Speaker. We have taken, under this government, the share of our trade covered by our export agreements from less than 30% to 70%, and we're going to take it to 90%, Mr Speaker. The agricultural sector, Mr Speaker, is growing at $100 billion. It'll be a $100 billion sector by 2030 under the plan that we're putting in place. So we have a plan, Mr Speaker. But what is happening on the side of the Labor Party, and I'm asked about the Labor Party, is chaos, Mr Speaker. It's chaos, it's uncertainty, and in New South Wales, Mr Speaker, there's the big stench of corruption, Mr Speaker. What we're seeing in New South Wales, the Leader of the Opposition's home division, is when I said, and I mentioned it on the weekend, when I said we have to recycle plastics, Mr Speaker, I didn't mean Aldi plastic bags stuffed full of cash. That was not my plan, Mr Speaker, but it is certainly the plan of the New South Wales Labor Party.
The Prime Minister concluded his answer. Members on my left, the member— I was about to say the member for Batman. I know it's changed. He has a reprieve at this point. Cooper, thank you. Okay, do you want me to warn her too? Thanks for your help. The question's over, so I'm just going to call the next question on, which is the member for Menzies.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I asked the Minister for Population, Cities and Urban Infrastructure if he could update the House on how the government is delivering stability and reliability for motorists, particularly those who use the very significant Monash Freeway in Melbourne.
The Minister has the call.
Could I thank the member for Menzies for his question and for his commitment to busting congestion right across Melbourne. Mr Speaker, the Morrison government is providing certainty and stability for all Australians through our $100 billion investment pipeline in infrastructure. And one of the more important projects in this pipeline is the Monash Freeway upgrade. And for those who don't know the Monash, it goes from the CBD of Melbourne all the way out to Pakenham and beyond in the southeastern suburbs of the city. And this is one of the fastest growing parts not just of Melbourne, but indeed of Australia. When you look at the Monash itself, there's 470,000 trips are taken on that busy road every single day. And out in the part where the member for Latrobe resides, you have something like a 4.4% annual growth year on year in terms of the traffic volume. What does that mean? It means that many parts of the Monash at different times of the day are coming all the way to a crawl, bumper to bumper, people stuck in traffic. All they're seeing is the brake lights of the traffic in front of them rather than getting home or getting to work early in the morning. Now, last week, Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister, the Victorian Premier, the member for Latrobe and myself announced an extra $368 million to get Stage 2 of the Monash upgrade going. Now, Stage 2 involves 36 kilometres of new freeway lanes on the Monash, and that's in two sections, one between Warrigal Road and Eastlink, and the second between Clyde Road and Cardinia Road. And in that section we'll be boosting the capacity of the freeway by over 50%. Now, we're getting on with the job. Construction is beginning next year, and it will be completed by 2022. So we're really making a difference in getting cracking on this project. Mr Speaker, what does this mean for everyday residents in south-east Melbourne? First up, it means jobs. In fact, there's 600 jobs that are going to be constructed during the construction phase alone, and there's a further 10,000 jobs that will be activated through this project by connecting to a new innovation precinct. But equally importantly, it is time savings.
This is an absolute congestion buster, and it will save 22 minutes per day for people who are travelling from Melbourne into the city and back, Mr Speaker. That means almost 2 hours a week that people will be saving, real-time savings, so that they can spend time at home or playing sport or doing what they want to do rather than being stuck in traffic. Of course, Mr Speaker, this is part of our overall plan that we are rolling out across Melbourne, across Australia, to provide certainty and stability for all Australians and busting congestion in the process.
The minister's time has concluded. The member for Hotham has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Can the Treasurer confirm that under this coalition government, business investment has fallen 20% to its lowest level since the 1990s recession?
The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, I can confirm non-mining investment is growing 1.4% through the year compared to negative 8.4% through the year when Labor left office, Mr Speaker. So the record there is that we have overseen a better result when it comes to non-mining investment than the Labor Party did, Mr Speaker. Now, in terms of the mining sector, we have seen a transition from the investment stage to the production phase, and one of the positive points out of the national accounts for the June quarter was actually mining investment was up. Mining investment was up, Mr Speaker. So the reality is, under the coalition, we are creating more than 1.4 million new jobs. We are lowering taxes, Mr Speaker, and we're bringing the budget back into surplus. But the question I have for the member for Hotham and for all those opposite, Mr Speaker, is why do they continue to talk down the Australian economy, Mr Speaker?
The Treasurer will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. The standing orders don't provide for him to ask questions.
No,
they provide for him to answer the question in which he was asked.
Well, I tell you, we're halfway through the answer. Just if the member can resume her seat, I'm not going to do two at once. I've got to correct the Leader of the Opposition. I'm sort of loath to do so. The standing orders don't make provision for members of the opposition to answer them, but there is a long history of rhetorical questions being asked, and I know it's frustrating, but I have a different issue with the Treasurer. I think he's straying off the subject matter of the question. So I'd like him to confine himself to what was a specific question.
I have said our record of investment is better than the Labor Party when it comes to the non-mining sector, Mr Speaker. We've created more jobs, we're lowering taxes and we're bringing the budget back into surplus.
Okay. And the member for Reid.
To the Minister for Health. Will the Minister update the House on how the stability and certainty of a strong economy helps to deliver essential health services such as bulk billing and support for ovarian cancer?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Reid, who comes to this place after a distinguished career as a child psychologist and somebody who's been deeply engaged in delivering services to Australian families. One of the things she knows, though, also as a small business person, is that in order for any business or any enterprise or any government to be successful, they have to live within their means. And by doing that, we've been able to support a growth in essential services right across the health sector. I was pleased only last week to be able to release new bulk billing figures, and those bulk billing figures show that more Australians than ever before are visiting the doctor for free. It's an increase from 82.2% when we came into government for the bulk billing rate, the rate at which people are able to access GP services for free, by 4% now to an all-time record bulk billing rate of 86.2%. What that means is that over 86 out of every 100 visits to the GP are free.
Member for Macarthur.
And that means an increase in real terms of 7 million bulk billed visits to the doctor across Australia over the last year. That's good news for patients. That's good news for Australians who want to be able to access their health services. But it's also part of a much broader investment in health. One of the issues which the member for Reid raised is ovarian cancer. And today we see the story of Jill Emerson, a wonderful, passionate Australian who has been battling ovarian cancer. She, along with many other courageous women, have been advocates for more investment and more research and more clinical trials in this space. I was delighted to announce earlier today that the Australian government will be investing, through the Medical Research Future Fund, an extra $15 million in rare cancers, rare diseases, clinical trials for ovarian cancer and other reproductive cancers. This means whether it's in cervical cancer, whether it's in peritoneal cancer, whether it's in testicular cancer, these investments will lead to real trials that will help Australian patients with treatments that they would otherwise not have been able to have accessed. It means that we will also be setting a path to new medicines being made available for all Australian patients. New medicines such as Lynparza or Olaparib, which has been made available on the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme. And for the 1,500 Australian women who face a diagnosis of ovarian cancer every year, for the 1,000 Australian women who tragically lose that battle, Jill's work and the work of patient advocates, the work of our medical researchers will now be empowered with additional trials and additional hope for Australian patients and Australians everywhere.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.